I thought I knew what family loyalty meant until I discovered my parents had been systematically stealing my inheritance for 20 years while treating my golden child brother like royalty. The family rules that pushed me to the margins suddenly made perfect sense when I found the hidden bank statements. But what they did not expect was that their quiet, obedient daughter had been documenting everything. Now it is time for some rules of my own. Before we dive into this wild family revenge story, I want to know where my amazing viewers are watching from today. Are you Team Justice or Team Forgiveness? Hit that like button if you believe karma always comes back around, and do not forget to subscribe because trust me, you will want to see how this family drama unfolds. The twists ahead will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood loyalty. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 28 years I believed I was the problem child in my family. Growing up in suburban Dallas, Texas, I was constantly reminded that I was not living up to the family standards that my younger brother Jake seemed to effortlessly meet. While Jake got brand new cars for his 16th birthday, I got a lecture about fiscal responsibility. While he received full college tuition payments, I worked 3 jobs to pay my way through community college. The message was clear: Jake was the investment and I was the expense. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had built their lives around what they called family rules. These were not your typical household guidelines about chores and curfews. These were comprehensive life directives that seemed designed specifically to keep me in my place while elevating Jake to golden child status. Rule number 1: family money goes to family investments, and apparently I did not qualify as a worthwhile investment. See? Rule number 2: family decisions are made by family leaders, and somehow, despite being older, I was never considered leadership material. Rule number 3: family loyalty means accepting your role without question, and my role was clearly to be grateful for whatever scraps I received. The rules became more apparent as we grew older. When Jake dropped out of his expensive private university after 2 years to pursue his dream of becoming a social media influencer, my parents celebrated his entrepreneurial spirit and continued funding his lifestyle. When I graduated summa cum laude from community college and wanted to transfer to complete my bachelor's degree, I was told that education beyond necessity was selfish and that I should focus on contributing to the family instead. I moved back home after graduation, paying rent, to live in my childhood bedroom while Jake lived rent-free in the converted garage that my parents had transformed into a luxury apartment complete with a kitchenette and separate entrance. I worked as an administrative assistant at a local law firm during the day and helped with my parents' small accounting business in the evenings. Every paycheck was scrutinized, with my parents suggesting how much I should contribute to household expenses and family emergencies that seemed to coincidentally align with Jake's latest business venture needs. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration. My grandmother, my father's mother, had passed away 6 months earlier, and the family was gathering to discuss her estate. Grandma Rose had always been my champion, the one person in the family who saw my potential and encouraged my dreams. She had often told me privately that she was proud of my work ethic and determination, and that someday I would be rewarded for staying true to myself despite the family dynamics. As we sat around the dining room table that had witnessed countless family meetings where my voice was systematically dismissed, my father cleared his throat and began reading from what he claimed was my grandmother's will. According to the document, the bulk of her estate, including her house and savings, would go to Jake to help establish his future. I would receive her jewelry box and some personal items. The reasoning my father explained was that Grandma Rose believed Jake needed more support to reach his potential, while I had already proven I could make it on my own. Something felt wrong immediately. Grandma Rose had never been the type to play favorites so obviously, and she had always emphasized fairness and hard work. Moreover, I remembered her telling me just months before her death that she had made provisions to help me finally get the education I deserved. The will my father read sounded nothing like the woman who had raised him to value integrity above all else. That night I could not sleep. I kept replaying conversations with my grandmother, her promises about helping me build a better future, and her concerns about the way my parents treated me compared to Jake. She had seen the inequality in our household and had often expressed frustration about it in private conversations with me. It did not make sense that she would reinforce that same inequality in her final wishes. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the probate court in our county and requested information about my grandmother's estate proceedings. What I learned made my blood run cold. According to the court records, Grandma Rose had indeed left a will, but it was not the document my father had read to us. The real will filed with the court told a very different story. In her actual final wishes, my grandmother had left her house to be sold with proceeds split equally between Jake and me. Her savings account, which contained nearly $200,000, was designated specifically for my education fund with a note attached explaining that she wanted to ensure I had the same opportunities that had been freely given to my brother. Jake would receive her car and some family heirlooms, but the bulk of the monetary estate was intended to level the playing field that my parents had skewed for so many years. My hands were shaking as I read the official documents. Not only had my parents lied about my grandmother's final wishes, but they had somehow gained access to her estate and were in the process of redirecting everything according to their own preferences. The house had already been sold, and the money had been deposited into an account that listed my father as the primary beneficiary with Jake as the secondary. My grandmother's savings had been transferred to an education fund, but one that Jake controlled supposedly for his future business education needs. I sat in my car outside the courthouse for an hour, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. This was not just favoritism or unfair family dynamics. This was theft. My parents had stolen my inheritance and created an elaborate lie to cover their tracks. They had used their positions as executors of my grandmother's estate to rewrite her final wishes according to their own twisted version of family rules. The discovery of my parents' theft lit a fire inside me that I had never felt before. For years, I had internalized their messages about my worth, accepting their version of family hierarchy as natural law. But stealing my grandmother's final gift to me was not about family dynamics or different parenting styles. This was criminal behavior, and I was not going to let it slide. My first instinct was to confront them directly, to storm into the house and demand answers while waving the court documents in their faces. But 28 years of being dismissed and minimized had taught me that direct confrontation with my parents was like trying to argue with a brick wall. They would find ways to justify their actions, twist the narrative to make me the villain, and probably convince themselves that they were protecting me from the burden of managing money responsibly. Instead, I decided to approach this situation with the same strategic thinking I had learned during my years working at the law firm. I had watched attorneys build cases methodically gathering evidence piece by piece until they had an airtight argument that could not be disputed or deflected. If I was going to take on my parents, I needed to be smarter than I had ever been before. I started by making copies of every official document I had obtained from the probate court. The real will, the estate filings, the transfer records, and the bank account information were all carefully documented and stored in multiple locations. I opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town and created digital backups on a secure cloud service that my parents could never access. Next, I began what I called my investigation phase. I needed to understand exactly how my parents had managed to circumvent my grandmother's wishes and whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of financial manipulation. I requested my grandmother's medical records from the months before her death, looking for any signs that she might have been coerced or confused when making her estate decisions. What I found was evidence of a sharp, mentally competent woman who had been very specific about her intentions. The medical records included notes from a conversation my grandmother had with her doctor about her concerns regarding family dynamics and her desire to help me achieve educational goals that had been denied to me. She had even mentioned her frustration with my parents' obvious favoritism and her intention to correct that imbalance through her estate planning. These records became crucial evidence that my grandmother's real will accurately reflected her true intentions. I also began investigating my parents' financial activities more closely. Working in their accounting business had given me access to certain information, and I started paying closer attention to their client files and business practices. What I discovered was alarming. My parents had a history of creative financial management that bordered on unethical. They had been skimming money from their business clients, manipulating tax returns to their advantage, and hiding assets and accounts that were not properly reported to the IRS. The pattern became clear. My parents saw money as something that belonged to whoever was clever enough to control it. They had been teaching Jake this same philosophy, involving him in their schemes and preparing him to take over their questionable business practices. Meanwhile, they had kept me away from the financial side of their operations, probably because they knew I had too much integrity to participate in their games. Armed with this growing mountain of evidence, I made my next strategic move. I contacted an attorney who specialized in estate law and financial fraud. Margaret Rodriguez was a woman in her 50s who had built her reputation on taking cases that other lawyers found too complicated or risky. When I explained my situation during our initial consultation, her eyes lit up with the kind of professional excitement that told me I had found the right advocate. Margaret reviewed all of my documentation and confirmed what I already suspected: my parents had committed multiple felonies. They had fraudulently manipulated an estate, stolen inheritance money, and potentially violated federal tax laws in the process. But she also warned me that taking legal action against my own parents would be emotionally devastating and would likely destroy any possibility of family reconciliation. I looked her straight in the eye and told her that my parents had destroyed our family relationship the moment they decided to steal from my grandmother's grave. I was not interested in reconciliation with people who saw me as an obstacle to their plans rather than a daughter deserving of love and respect. I wanted justice, and I wanted them to face consequences for their actions. The legal strategy we developed was methodical and devastating. Rather than filing a single lawsuit, we would build a comprehensive case that addressed multiple violations simultaneously. We would file complaints with the probate court regarding the estate manipulation, report the tax fraud to the IRS, and pursue criminal charges for theft and financial elder abuse, since my grandmother had been in her 80s when her estate was manipulated. But before we moved forward with any legal action, Margaret suggested something that initially seemed counterintuitive: we should give my parents an opportunity to confess and make restitution voluntarily. This was not about mercy or family loyalty. It was about strengthening our case by demonstrating that we had attempted to resolve the matter privately before pursuing legal remedies. The confrontation was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. I told them I needed to discuss some concerns about Grandma Rose's estate and that I would be bringing a legal advisor with me. My parents seemed annoyed, but not particularly worried. They probably assumed I had discovered some minor discrepancy that could be explained away with their usual condescending explanations about my lack of financial sophistication. Jake was there too, lounging in the living room with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world owed him everything he had received. When Margaret and I walked in with our briefcases and serious expressions, the atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. My parents exchanged glances that told me they were beginning to understand this was not going to be a typical family discussion. Margaret began by laying out the facts in her crisp, professional voice. She presented the real will, the court documents, and the evidence of financial manipulation with the precision of a prosecutor making an opening statement. As she spoke, I watched my parents' faces transform from confusion to alarm to barely contained panic. Jake, who had been scrolling through his phone when we started, gradually began paying attention as he realized that his entire lifestyle was built on stolen money. When Margaret finished her presentation, the room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to my grandmother. My father was the first to speak, and his response was exactly what I had expected. He claimed there had been a misunderstanding, that my grandmother had changed her mind about the will multiple times, and that they had simply followed what they believed were her final wishes. My mother jumped in with crocodile tears, talking about how much they loved me and how they had only been trying to protect me from the stress of managing a large inheritance. Jake remained silent, but I could see his mind working, probably calculating how much of his lifestyle he would have to give up if the truth came out. Margaret let them finish their explanations before delivering the knockout punch. She informed them that we had evidence of systematic financial fraud extending beyond just my grandmother's estate. We had documentation of their business practices, their tax violations, and their pattern of financial manipulation that painted a picture of criminal enterprise rather than isolated mistakes. The room erupted in chaos. My father started yelling about family loyalty and how I was betraying the people who had raised me. My mother sobbed about ungrateful children and family shame. Jake finally found his voice and accused me of being jealous and vindictive, claiming that I was destroying the family out of spite. I stood up and looked at each of them in turn before speaking the words I had been rehearsing for weeks. I told them that they had taught me everything I needed to know about family loyalty by stealing from my grandmother and lying to my face about it. I explained that they had shown me exactly what kind of people they were, and that I had decided to choose my own path forward rather than enabling their criminal behavior. Margaret handed my father a formal letter outlining our demands full restitution of my grandmother's estate. Within 30 days, a written confession detailing their fraud and their agreement to cooperate with any government investigations that might arise. If they refused, we would be filing criminal complaints and civil lawsuits the following Monday morning. As we walked out of the house, I could hear my family falling apart behind us. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was walking toward something better rather than running away from something toxic. The real battle was just beginning. The 30-day deadline I had given my parents came and went without any response. I was not surprised, but I was disappointed. Some small part of me had hoped that confronted with irrefutable evidence and serious consequences, they might choose honesty and accountability over continued deception. Instead, their silence told me everything I needed to know about their character and their intentions. Margaret filed our first round of legal actions on a Monday morning that felt like the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The probate court complaint challenged the fraudulent handling of my grandmother's estate. The IRS complaint detailed the tax fraud and unreported income from their business practices. The criminal complaint filed with the district attorney's office outlined theft, elder fraud, and conspiracy charges that could result in serious jail time if convicted. Within 48 hours of filing, my phone started ringing with calls from my extended family. My parents had launched their own campaign reaching out to aunts, uncles, and cousins to paint me as a vindictive daughter who was trying to destroy the family over money. They claimed I was mentally unstable, that I had misunderstood innocent mistakes, and that I was working with an unscrupulous attorney who was manipulating me for profit. The smear campaign was comprehensive and vicious. My mother called my workplace and spoke to my supervisor, claiming she was concerned about my mental health and suggesting that I might be having a breakdown that could affect my job performance. My father contacted some of my college friends through social media, sharing fabricated stories about my supposed drug use and emotional instability. Jake took to his social media platforms to share cryptic posts about toxic family members and people who bite the hand that feeds them. His followers who knew nothing about the real situation rallied around him with supportive comments about cutting off negative people and focusing on positive energy. The irony of his posts about family loyalty while defending stolen money was not lost on me. For a few weeks, the isolation was overwhelming. I found myself second-guessing my decisions and wondering if I was destroying relationships that could have been repaired through forgiveness and communication. The legal process was slow and expensive, even with Margaret working on a contingency basis. Some days it felt like I was fighting an impossible battle against people who would always have more resources and fewer scruples than I possessed. But then, something unexpected happened. My grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Williams, contacted me through the law firm. Patricia was a retired nurse in her 70s who had been close friends with my grandmother for over 15 years. She had been following the legal proceedings through public records and felt compelled to reach out because she had information that could help my case. Patricia invited me to her house for tea, and what she told me changed everything. In the months before my grandmother's death, Grandma Rose had confided in Patricia about her concerns regarding my parents' treatment of me and her plans to help correct the imbalance through her will. But more importantly, Patricia had witnessed several concerning interactions between my parents and my grandmother during her final weeks. According to Patricia, my parents had visited my grandmother multiple times in the hospital, often staying for hours and bringing documents for her to sign. During one of these visits, Patricia had been in the room when my father pressured my grandmother about changing her will to better reflect current family needs. My grandmother had become visibly agitated and asked him to leave, but he had continued pushing until the nurses intervened. Patricia had also overheard phone conversations where my parents discussed strategies for managing my grandmother's estate before she died. They had talked about the need to protect family resources from poor decision-making and ensure that money went where it would do the most good. At the time, Patricia had not understood the full implications of these conversations, but in light of recent events, she realized she had witnessed the planning stages of their fraud. Most crucially, Patricia had kept copies of documents that my grandmother had asked her to hold for safekeeping. These included letters my grandmother had written to me that were never delivered, explaining her estate plans and her hopes for my future. The letters provided powerful evidence of my grandmother's mental state and intentions that directly contradicted my parents' version of events. Margaret was thrilled with Patricia's testimony and documentation, but even more importantly for me, Patricia became the first member of my support network. She introduced me to other neighbors and community members who had known and loved my grandmother. These connections led to a growing circle of allies who were outraged by my parents' behavior and eager to help me seek justice. Through Patricia, I met Dr. James Harrison, my grandmother's longtime physician, who was willing to testify about her mental competence and her expressed concerns about family dynamics. I also connected with Tom Rodriguez, Margaret's brother, who was a forensic accountant specializing in financial fraud cases. Tom offered to examine my parents' business records pro bono because he was disgusted by their exploitation of an elderly woman's trust. The most surprising ally came from an unexpected source. My father's business partner of 12 years, David Walsh, contacted Margaret's office requesting a confidential meeting. David had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with my parents' business practices and had been considering dissolving their partnership. When he learned about the estate fraud through courthouse gossip, he decided it was time to come forward with information about their other questionable activities. David provided detailed records of client account manipulations, tax return falsifications, and money laundering schemes that my parents had been operating for years. He explained that he had initially participated because my father had convinced him these practices were standard industry strategies for minimizing client tax burdens. But as the schemes became more elaborate and obviously illegal, David had begun keeping his own records as insurance against potential legal problems. The evidence David provided was devastating. It showed a pattern of criminal financial behavior extending back over a decade, involving dozens of clients and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent transactions. This information transformed my case from a family inheritance dispute into a major financial fraud investigation that attracted the attention of federal authorities. As our evidence mounted and our network of allies grew stronger, my parents began to panic. They hired their own attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer named Richard Stone, who was known for representing white-collar criminals. Stone immediately went on the offensive, filing motions to dismiss our complaints and demanding sanctions against Margaret for filing frivolous lawsuits. But Stone's aggressive tactics backfired spectacularly. His motions were so poorly researched and factually inaccurate that the judges in both probate and criminal court issued sharp rebukes during hearings. More damaging for my parents, Stone's combative approach attracted media attention to the case, which was exactly what they had been trying to avoid. The local newspaper picked up the story of the family inheritance fraud case, and the coverage was brutal for my parents. The reporter had done thorough research interviewing neighbors, former business associates, and court officials who painted a picture of systematic greed and family betrayal. Jake's social media posts were featured prominently in the article, showing how he had been living lavishly while knowing his lifestyle was funded by stolen money. The media attention brought even more allies out of the woodwork. Former clients of my parents' accounting business contacted Margaret to report suspicious practices they had noticed but never questioned. Other families who had dealt with estate issues came forward to share similar stories of manipulation and fraud by people they had trusted. But the media coverage also escalated the conflict to a new level. My parents realized that their reputations and their freedom were now at serious risk. The evidence against them was overwhelming, their legal strategy was failing, and their attempts to discredit me had only brought more scrutiny to their own behavior. That was when they decided to play their most desperate card. They would try to turn my own allies against me by revealing secrets they had been holding back for years. They knew things about me that I had never shared with anyone, vulnerabilities they had been saving for exactly this kind of situation. The betrayal that came next would test everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and the difference between the family you are born into and the family you choose for yourself. The devastating blow came from the person I least expected to turn against me. David Walsh, the business partner who had provided crucial evidence about my parents' financial crimes, called me on a Thursday evening with panic in his voice. He claimed that my parents had discovered his cooperation with our investigation and were threatening to destroy his life unless he recanted his testimony. According to David, my parents had confronted him with evidence of his own financial improprieties that could result in criminal charges and the loss of his accounting license. They had been documenting his participation in their schemes for years, creating a paper trail that made him look like the mastermind while positioning themselves as unwilling participants who had been manipulated by his expertise. The conversation felt surreal as David explained how my parents had played a longer game than any of us had realized. They had been setting up fall guys for their criminal activities from the beginning, ensuring that if their schemes were ever exposed, they would have scapegoats to blame. David was just one of several business associates who had been maneuvered into compromising positions that could be used as leverage when needed. David begged me to drop the case, claiming that my parents had promised to make full restitution for my grandmother's estate if I would just walk away from the criminal charges. He painted a picture of a family that could still be healed if I would choose forgiveness over vengeance, and he emphasized that continuing the legal battle would destroy innocent people who had been caught up in my parents' schemes. I felt sick listening to his pleading voice, but what truly devastated me was what came next. David revealed that my parents had shared personal information about me that I had never told anyone except my grandmother. They knew about my struggle with depression during college, my brief hospitalization for anxiety attacks, and my history of therapy sessions that I had paid for secretly while living at home. But most damaging of all, they had somehow discovered that I had been in a relationship with a woman during college, something I had never told them because I knew their conservative views would lead to rejection and judgment. They were threatening to share this information publicly, claiming it explained my vindictive behavior toward the family and my desire to destroy traditional family values. The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted. My parents understood exactly which pressure points would cause maximum damage to my credibility and my psychological stability. They were betting that my fear of public humiliation and family shame would outweigh my desire for justice. David's betrayal felt like a knife in my back because I had trusted him completely. He had seemed genuinely disgusted by my parents' behavior and committed to helping expose their crimes. Now I realized he had been playing both sides all along, gathering information about our legal strategy while maintaining plausible deniability about his own criminal liability. Within 24 hours of David's phone call, our legal case began falling apart. He formally withdrew his testimony and requested that all documents he had provided be returned immediately. Without his evidence about the broader financial fraud, our case was significantly weakened, though we still had solid ground for the estate theft charges. But the personal attacks escalated quickly. My parents began sharing selected portions of my therapy records, which they had somehow obtained with extended family members. They framed my mental health treatment as evidence of instability and vindictiveness, suggesting that my accusations against them were products of psychological problems rather than legitimate grievances. The violation of my medical privacy was devastating on multiple levels. Not only had they breached my personal boundaries in the most intimate way possible, but they were weaponizing my efforts to heal and grow as ammunition against my character. The therapy sessions where I had worked through the trauma of their emotional abuse were being twisted into proof that I was an unreliable narrator of my own experiences. Jake joined the attack with renewed enthusiasm, creating social media posts that hinted at family members who struggled with mental health issues and made poor decisions because of their psychological problems. He shared articles about vindictive personality disorders and the dangers of enabling mentally unstable family members who refused to accept help. The smear campaign was so effective that some of our allies began questioning their support. Patricia Williams remained steadfast, but other community members started distancing themselves from what was being portrayed as a mentally unstable woman's vendetta against her loving family. The narrative was shifting away from financial crimes toward family dysfunction and personal vendettas. Margaret remained committed to the case, but she had to deliver some harsh truths about our prospects. The estate theft charges were still viable, but without David's testimony about the broader financial fraud, we were unlikely to see criminal charges that would result in serious consequences for my parents. They would probably face civil penalties and be required to make restitution, but they would avoid jail time and maintain their professional licenses. Even worse, my parents' attorney had filed countersuit claiming defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of legal process. They were seeking damages for the harm to their reputation and business, and they were demanding that I pay their legal fees as punishment for filing frivolous lawsuits. The legal costs were mounting beyond anything I could afford, even with Margaret working on contingency. The emotional toll was even higher as I watched my personal life being dissected and weaponized by people who claimed to love me. I began questioning whether the fight for justice was worth the price I was paying in terms of privacy, dignity, and peace of mind. For the first time since discovering the theft, I considered whether David might be right about walking away from the criminal charges in exchange for restitution. My grandmother's money would be returned, and I could start rebuilding my life away from the toxic dynamics that had defined my family for so long. Perhaps cutting my losses and moving forward was the healthiest choice for everyone involved. But late at night, alone in my apartment, I kept coming back to the same fundamental question: if I walked away now, would my parents face any real consequences for their actions? Would they learn anything from this experience? Or would they simply become more careful about covering their tracks while continuing to exploit and manipulate anyone who trusted them? The answer to those questions would come from a source I never could have anticipated. Someone who had been watching this family drama unfold with professional interest and personal investment in seeing justice served. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday morning when Margaret called me with excitement I had not heard in her voice for weeks. A new witness had contacted her office, someone with evidence that could completely change the trajectory of our case. Federal Agent Lisa Thompson from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had been independently investigating my parents' business activities and wanted to meet with us immediately. Agent Thompson explained that my parents had been on the federal radar for over 2 years as part of a broader investigation into tax fraud schemes operated by small accounting firms. Our civil lawsuit had provided the missing pieces they needed to build a comprehensive criminal case that went far beyond my grandmother's estate theft. The scope of my parents' criminal enterprise was breathtaking. They had been operating what amounted to a money laundering operation disguised as an accounting business, helping clients hide assets, falsify income reports, and evade taxes through complex shell company arrangements. The estate theft was just one example of their willingness to steal money whenever an opportunity presented itself. Agent Thompson had been building her case quietly, using financial surveillance and informants to document the full extent of their crimes. David Walsh had not been their only accomplice turned victim. There were at least 6 other business associates who had been manipulated into participating in illegal schemes and then threatened with exposure when they tried to withdraw their cooperation. The federal investigation had uncovered a pattern that explained everything about my family dynamics. My parents had been grooming Jake to take over their criminal operation, teaching him their methods, and gradually involving him in increasingly serious financial crimes. They had kept me away from their business activities because they recognized that I had too much integrity to participate willingly and too much intelligence to be easily manipulated. My grandmother's estate had represented a perfect opportunity to test their ability to commit major theft while maintaining plausible deniability. If they could successfully steal my inheritance while convincing everyone it was a legitimate family decision, they would have proven their skills at large-scale fraud. The fact that their victim was a beloved family member made the crime even more useful as a demonstration of their willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain their lifestyle. Agent Thompson also revealed that the personal information my parents had been using to attack my credibility was itself evidence of additional crimes. They had obtained my therapy records through identity theft and computer fraud, bribing a clerk at the medical records company to provide confidential information. The violation of my medical privacy was not just ethically wrong, but federally illegal under healthcare privacy laws. The evidence Agent Thompson presented was overwhelming and indisputable. Financial records, recorded phone conversations, email exchanges, and witness testimony painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior that had been escalating for years. My parents had not just stolen from my grandmother. They had been stealing from clients, business partners, and government agencies while building a criminal empire disguised as a family business. Most importantly for our case, Agent Thompson had evidence that directly contradicted David Walsh's recanted testimony. Federal wiretaps had recorded conversations where my parents discussed their strategy for pressuring David to withdraw his cooperation by threatening him with manufactured evidence of crimes he had not actually committed. The recordings proved that his betrayal had been coerced through blackmail rather than voluntary. Margaret was practically glowing as Agent Thompson explained how the federal case would proceed. Criminal charges would be filed against both of my parents and Jake within the next 2 weeks. The charges would include tax evasion, money laundering, elder fraud, identity theft, computer crimes, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. The potential sentences ranged from 15 to 30 years in federal prison. But Agent Thompson had an even better surprise for me. The federal investigation had uncovered assets that my parents had been hiding from their civil attorney and from our lawsuit. These included offshore bank accounts, real estate investments, and business ownership interests that were worth significantly more than my grandmother's estate. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, these hidden assets would be seized and could be used to compensate victims of their crimes. The revelation about hidden assets explained why my parents had been so confident about fighting our lawsuit. They had been operating under the assumption that even if they lost the civil case and had to pay restitution, they could afford the judgment from their secret wealth. They had never anticipated that federal investigators were tracking their every financial move and building a case that would result in the seizure of everything they owned. Agent Thompson also brought news about David Walsh that vindicated my original trust in him. The federal investigation had revealed that David had actually been working as an informant for the IRS for over 6 months, gathering evidence about my parents' crimes while pretending to continue their partnership. His apparent betrayal of our case had been part of a coordinated strategy to lure my parents into making incriminating statements while they thought they had successfully intimidated him. The recorded conversations between David and my parents were devastating for their defense. They had admitted to stealing my grandmother's estate, discussed strategies for destroying evidence, and revealed additional crimes that federal investigators had not previously known about. Their confidence in David's silence had led them to confess to everything they had been trying to hide. Margaret immediately filed motions to introduce the federal evidence into our civil case, transforming our inheritance dispute into a component of a major criminal investigation. The judges assigned to our cases expedited all proceedings once they learned about the federal implications, and my parents' attorney found himself completely outmaneuvered by developments his clients had never warned him about. The media attention intensified dramatically once news of the federal charges broke. What had started as a local family dispute was now being covered as a major white-collar crime story with implications for hundreds of victims across multiple states. Reporters discovered that my parents' accounting firm had been used as a model for similar operations in other cities, making their case part of a nationwide investigation into small firm financial fraud. Jake's social media presence became a liability overnight when federal agents began analyzing his posts for evidence of knowledge about criminal activities. His previous posts about family loyalty and cutting off toxic people were now being interpreted as evidence of his complicity in covering up crimes. His lavish lifestyle, funded entirely by stolen money, was documented in detail across multiple social media platforms. The community response was swift and devastating for my parents. Former clients filed lawsuits seeking damages for fraudulent tax advice. Professional licensing boards opened investigations that would result in the permanent loss of their accounting credentials. Even their church, where they had been prominent members for over 20 years, asked them to step down from leadership positions pending resolution of the criminal charges. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching their carefully constructed facade of respectability crumble under the weight of truth. For years, they had presented themselves as pillars of the community's successful business owners who embodied traditional family values and financial responsibility. Now everyone could see that their success had been built on theft, Their family values included systematic cruelty to their own daughter, and their financial responsibility extended only to hiding their crimes effectively. The federal case moved quickly once charges were filed. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, my parents had no choice but to negotiate plea agreements. But Agent Thompson made it clear that any plea deal would require full restitution to all victims, complete cooperation with ongoing investigations, and significant prison time that would reflect the seriousness of their crimes. As I watched my parents' criminal empire collapse around them, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and relief. The justice I had been seeking was finally within reach, but the cost had been higher than I ever imagined. The family I had grown up with was gone forever, destroyed by their own greed and cruelty. But for the first time in my life, I was free to build the kind of family I actually wanted. The final courtroom scene was everything I had dreamed of and nothing like I had expected. My parents sat at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, their expensive clothes and confident demeanor replaced by the hollow look of people who finally understood the consequences of their actions. Jake sat beside them, no longer the golden child, but a co-conspirator facing his own federal charges. Judge Patricia Morrison was known for her tough sentences in white-collar crime cases, and she did not disappoint. After reviewing the extensive evidence of my parents' crimes, she sentenced my father to 22 years in federal prison and my mother to 18 years. Jake, who had cooperated more fully with investigators, received 12 years, but would be eligible for parole in 8 if he continued to assist with ongoing investigations. The financial restitution was comprehensive and devastating for them. Beyond returning my grandmother's estate with interest, they were ordered to pay damages to dozens of victims whose lives had been damaged by their crimes. The total judgment exceeded $3 million, which meant that every asset they had accumulated through legitimate or illegitimate means would be seized and liquidated. But the most meaningful moment came when Judge Morrison addressed me directly from the bench. She commended my courage in exposing crimes that could have continued indefinitely if I had chosen family loyalty over legal accountability. She noted that my willingness to seek justice despite personal cost had protected countless future victims from falling prey to my parents' schemes. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive and largely supportive of my decision to pursue criminal charges. Editorial writers praised my example as proof that family relationships should not shield criminals from consequences, and victim advocates highlighted my case as evidence of why financial elder abuse must be prosecuted aggressively. The community response was overwhelmingly positive once the full scope of my parents' crimes became public. Former neighbors who had initially criticized me for attacking my own family now apologized and expressed admiration for my persistence in seeking truth. Local business owners who had been defrauded by my parents thanked me for making it possible for them to recover their stolen money. Patricia Williams became more than just a witness in my case. She became the grandmother figure I had lost when Grandma Rose died. She invited me to family dinners, introduced me to her children and grandchildren, and made it clear that I would always have a place at her table. Her acceptance and support helped heal wounds I had not even realized were still bleeding. Margaret Rodriguez also became a permanent part of my chosen family. Our professional relationship evolved into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared values about justice and integrity. She offered me a position at her law firm, recognizing that my experience with financial fraud cases had given me unique insights that could help other victims. Dr. Harrison, my grandmother's physician, connected me with a support group for adult children who had been financially abused by their families. Meeting other people who had survived similar experiences helped me understand that my family dynamics were not normal or acceptable, and that choosing to protect myself was not only reasonable but necessary. Agent Thompson became an unexpected mentor, encouraging me to consider a career in financial investigation where my personal experience with fraud could be channeled into preventing similar crimes. She helped me understand that my parents' betrayal had given me knowledge and motivation that could be used to protect other families from similar devastation. The financial recovery exceeded my wildest expectations. Beyond my grandmother's original estate, I received substantial restitution from the seizure of my parents' hidden assets. For the first time in my life, I had enough money to pursue any educational or career goal I wanted without worrying about basic survival. I used part of the settlement to complete my bachelor's degree and then pursue a master's degree in forensic accounting. My thesis focused on detection strategies for small firm financial fraud, drawing on my personal experience to identify warning signs that might help regulators spot similar schemes earlier. The house my grandmother had left me was sold according to her original wishes, but I used the proceeds to buy a smaller house in Patricia's neighborhood. Creating my own space filled with my own choices and free from the toxic memories of my family home felt like the ultimate declaration of independence from my past. Jake's imprisonment was perhaps the most complex emotional challenge for me. Despite everything he had done, I sometimes felt sad for the brother I had lost to my parents' corruption. He had been groomed from childhood to participate in their crimes, and part of me wondered what kind of person he might have become in a different family environment. But I also recognized that Jake had made choices as an adult and that his enthusiasm for living off stolen money while watching me struggle financially revealed something fundamental about his character. His letters from prison asking for forgiveness and financial support went unanswered, not out of cruelty but out of recognition that some boundaries must remain permanent. The most unexpected blessing came in the form of new family connections. Several relatives who had initially supported my parents reached out to apologize and express their admiration for my courage. My father's sister, who had been estranged from the family for years over financial disputes, reconnected with me and shared her own stories of my parents' manipulative behavior. These new relationships helped me understand that I had not been imagining the dysfunction in my family dynamics. Other family members had also been victims of my parents' manipulation and financial abuse, but they had chosen to distance themselves rather than fight back. My decision to pursue justice had validated their experiences and given them permission to speak their truth. 2 years after my parents' sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from my mother in federal prison. She had written to express her remorse and to ask if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship after she served her sentence. The letter was carefully crafted to sound contrite and loving, but I could see the manipulation techniques that had controlled me for so many years. I chose not to respond to her letter, not out of vengefulness, but out of self-protection. The family she was asking me to rebuild had never existed except in her fantasy where theft was justified and abuse was disguised as love. The healthy life I had built for myself was too precious to risk contaminating with people who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be loved. Today, my chosen family includes people who celebrate my successes without expecting anything in return, who support my dreams without trying to control my choices, and who love me for who I am rather than what I can provide for them. This is what family should have been all along, and I am grateful that losing my blood relatives led me to find my real family. The journey from discovering my parents' theft to watching them face justice taught me that loyalty is something that must be earned through love and respect, not demanded through guilt and manipulation. Family is not about shared blood, but about shared values, and sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior. So I want to ask all of you watching this story unfold, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and personal justice? Have you experienced the pain of discovering that people you trusted were betraying you behind your back? I know many of you have similar stories, and I want to hear them in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and sharing them helps other people feel less alone in their struggles. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know it meant something to you. Subscribe to my channel because I will be sharing more stories about overcoming family trauma and building healthy relationships. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that choosing yourself over toxic family dynamics is not selfish, but necessary for healing. Thank you for taking this journey with me and for supporting my decision to seek truth over comfortable lies. I hope my story encourages you to trust your instincts, document everything, and never let anyone convince you that abuse is acceptable just because it comes from family. Remember that you deserve love, respect, and honesty in all your relationships, and that sometimes the family you choose for yourself is so much better than the family you were born into. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth, and never let anyone steal your worth. Justice may take time, but it is always worth pursuing when it means protecting yourself and others from people who see love as weakness to be exploited.